boy swallowed his saliva. He was just about to take the pancakes from his classmate. A fly swatter struck him in the hand.
वापस करो स्टैनली।
Boy didn't bring his lunch. He was driven out of the classroom by the teacher. But he was so hungry, he had to go to the bathroom and drink tap water. And the language teacher found a reason. He stuttered into the student's lunch. The boy's name is Stanley. He's a very good kid, an optimistic and cheerful disposition. Make the class like him very much. One day, the new English teacher rewarded him with a piece of chocolate. He happily put it in his pocket, only to find that his pocket was broken. After school, Stanley generously shared this piece of hard-earned chocolate with his classmates. The days went by. Stanley still doesn't have lunch. The long lunch hour was the most torturous for him. Looking at the lunch boxes of the students, there are sweet potato chips, delicious cookies, and delicious burritos. The students ate with gusto. He could only hold back his gulps. The classmate asked him why he didn't bring his lunch. He pretended to pull at his trouser pocket, said his mother gave him money. Let him go out and buy something to eat. Day after day, Stanley always weaves reasons to deal with the questions of the students. The students stopped asking questions. They all share their lunch generously with Stanley. Stanley is only going to be shy about taking a small part, but that's enough. At least it'll hold him until school is over. However, the school's language teacher is a very stingy person. He never brought lunch. He always eats lunch from colleagues or students. The teacher secretly opened his colleague's lunchbox. He put his greasy hand in, pick up the food and shove it in his mouth. He still doesn't feel good after eating, so he went to the classroom again, ready to continue robbing students of their lunches. But this time he was late. Looking at the empty lunchbox and Stanley with his finger on it, he took all his anger out on the rice-munching Stanley.
डिब्बा तो लाता नहीं अपना, दूसरों के डिब्बे चढ़ता, तेरी वजह से मेरा बर्बाद।
After scolding him, he also looked at everyone fiercely, said he was coming tomorrow. Stanley dropped his eyes innocently. He left the classroom in grievance. The next day at lunch, the students invited Stanley to have dinner with him, but he left the classroom. Stanley's just gone. The language teacher is coming. He grabbed the children's lunch without fear. All the children could do was to keep swallowing. There's no way to do it. The teacher drank too fast. He spilled milk all over his body, and the children were stunned. In the days to come, every lunch hour, Stanley will leave the classroom early. His deskmate detected something different, so he quietly followed him out. He found that Stanley had not come home, but wandering alone in the street. The students decided to ask Stanley about everything. Stanley said his parents were out of town. No one made him lunch. The kind-hearted classmates decided to share their lunch with him. To keep the teacher from grabbing food, they decided to find a way to avoid the teacher. As soon as the class was over, they left the classroom. The language teacher couldn't find any trace of them. In desperation, the language teacher only ate his colleague's lunch, but he still didn't feel as good as the fat boy's lunch. Class begins the next day. He's been peeking at fat boy's lunchbox. He gulped and asked where the fat boy was eating. Lunchtime. The teacher went straight to the stairs, but fat boy isn't even here. Day 2. The teacher ran to the playground where the fat boy said he still hasn't found anything. While the teacher was being played around, the fat boy was eating happily on the terrace with Stanley, but they didn't expect it. The teacher found them in the end. He came to the roof and stared hard at everyone, finally took out all his anger on Stanley. You get out of here. Get out of here right now. He even told Stanley not to come to school without a lunch. As a result, the next day Stanley really did not come to school. The boy was taken in by his uncle because his parents died young. Every day after school, Stanley had to work in his uncle's shop. If he is careless, he will be beaten and scolded by his uncle, no matter how hard he works. His uncle would never prepare his lunch for school, because there's no lunch. Stanley was kicked out of school by the language teacher. He has not been to school for several days. Stanley wasn't in school. His classmates miss him very much. The students couldn't eat well without Stanley. Luckily, when the cook in the shop found out, he made lunch for Stanley with leftovers from the store. Although it's just some leftovers, but that's enough for Stanley. With lunch, Stanley is happy to go back to school. Good Stanley found the teacher, tell him he's got lunch, and to share it with him, begged the teacher to let him come back to school. At the moment, the teacher felt a great sense of guilt. He was ashamed of his selfish behavior. He took off his glasses, wiped the tears from his eyes. He left a letter of apology to Stanley, and then left the school in silence. Come to the classroom. Stanley generously shared his lunch with his classmates, and shared it with the teacher. In everyone's eyes, Stanley has always been that positive and optimistic. He never had a whining about life, even if his life was miserable, but he's still trying to embrace life. Here it is. Hope that all children in the world will be treated with tenderness.